Okay, good. So, hello everyone again, and so welcome to our first webinar series on macroeconomic development and inclusive growth in East and South Asia. Today's discussion we will focus on post-Keynesian perspective that look at on macroeconomic strategy in economic development. And Professor will discuss detail about economic policy and economic theory as a macroeconomic policy during the transformations time in the region, and also discuss the role of fiscal policy and monetary policy in economic development and how it will be useful as a tool that can support economic growth. And then he will discuss deeply about post-Keynesian perspective in terms of economic development. So I just introduce you a little bit about Professor Louis-Philippe. He is the full professor of economy at Laurentian University in Canada, where he has been teaching here since 2004. He is the co-editor in charge at the Review of Political Economy and the founder editor of the Review of Keynesian Economy. He also the co-editor, the co-director of Monetary Policy Institute and the editor of the Monetary blogs. He's editor in charge in the Anchor series of central banking and monetary policy, as well as co-editors of the new direction in post-Keynesian economy. He has been published a lot of academic articles, most of them 150, and also published books close to 40 books. And his recent book is about post-Keynesian economy and the brief history of economy thought. So I think, Professor, the floor is yours, and you will have around 40 to 45 minutes to talk, and then we will go to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to say thank you for inviting me. I am in Japan right now, and I'm giving a class at the university, and it's past my bedtime. It's almost 11:30 p.m. here. So, but I'm happy to stay up for this. Let me share my screen. There you go. And there you go. My talk today is reclaiming fiscal policy dominance, assaulting the citadel. Now, the expression, the citadel, of course, comes from Keynes, who had argued against assaulting the citadel, which is neoclassical economics, and that we needed to reject it. We know in the general theory, in the opening paragraph of the book, Keynes tells us that neoclassical theory, the policies and the theory can be disastrous and dangerous if we apply them to the facts of experience. So this is sort of my approach to economics. I am not a mainstream person. I find very little value in mainstream theory and policies. And these are going to be familiar themes that will come back throughout this presentation. As Kuzel has mentioned, I wear several hats. I'm editor-in-chief of the Review of Political Economy, but I created in 2008 the journal Review of Keynesian Economics. Some of you might know. I'm associate editors of a couple of other journals. Director of the Monetary Policy Institute, and that's an institute that does research on issues related to monetary policy, to central banking, to inflation. And one of the things we do is we publish a number of books on the topic, and we also host a weekly blog called the Monetary Blog. And it's the only blog in the world dedicated to central banking from a heterodox, from a critical perspective. You can follow us on Medium or on Twitter. And this is the book series that I alluded to. So the reason for this series is to explore, is to push our understanding of central banking. And we generally discuss topics that are not discussed or very little discussed by mainstream theory. Certainly the concept of monetary policy and income distribution, which goes back to Keynes, and many post-Keynesians in the 80s and 90s talked about it. It's presently going through a revival in post-Keynesian circles, but the mainstream largely got involved in this topic following the financial crisis. So this is when they started to get interested in the topic. And even then, there are vast differences between our approach and the mainstream approach, which I won't get into, but nevertheless. But it is the first book, I believe, on monetary policy and income distribution. And it's many of these books are the first in their fields. The next book that's going to come out in May, so very soon, is the one on gender. So it's a book dedicated to the impact of monetary policy from a gendered perspective. And it was a challenge to put that book together, only because there's very few articles, very little research being done on that topic. But I hope that this is going to lead the way to more research. And the next one after that will be the one on financial instability, which is certainly something that heterodox people have talked a lot about, especially Hyman Minsky, but others as well. And the book on social responsibility, democracy, again, first of its kind, and it's the relationship between central banking, or a discussion of central banking within democratic governance. It's tied to central bank independence, which is a big topic at the moment. But nevertheless, if you do have a chance to get your university to order them, please do. And as I said, I'm a non-repentant Keynesian or non-repentant post-Keynesian, going so far as to naming my dog John Maynard Canines. So there you go. By the way, I just want to say I am a big fan of Keynes, obviously, but I'm very critical of Keynes as well. But one of my, I think my favorite quote from Keynes was when he said, "My only regret in life was that I should have drank more champagne." Okay. So I want to start by briefly talking about an IMF blog that was written by Angus Deaton, a Nobel laureate, back in March, which was called Rethinking My Economics. And in this blog, he discusses basically how he's rethought a lot of his positions, many of his positions, and that mainstream economics is in disarray. And that there's a disconnect between policy and reality, and the failure to predict the crisis, of course, and perhaps even mainstream policies adopted during the crisis only made things worse. And so this was certainly a welcomed, critical, especially given the Nobel pedigree. It was certainly a welcomed blog, and it created quite the stir. But from my point of view, it's sort of déjà vu. I wrote a reply to it that was published today, actually, on the monetary blog, called Angry Angus. And I argue it's déjà vu. I mean, a number of economists have come out to argue very similar things. Draghi, the former governor of the European Central Bank, came out very recently and said the same thing, that some of the policies pursued by the central bank probably made things worse. And Janet Yellen has come out in a very sort of critical mea culpa about economic policy. So, excuse me, it's déjà vu economics, but it's certainly a welcome déjà vu. I'd rather have sort of that revisiting of the mea culpas than continuing in mainstream ignorance of what their theory and policies have done and are doing. But Angus's, which he very much liked, the blog, by the way, we talked about it. But in his blog, he says 5 of the areas that mainstream theory needs to focus on is that we need more discussion of power in economics, institutions, and the role of labor unions in increasing wages and fostering economic growth. We need more of a discussion on ethics. This is a topic I wrote about a couple of months ago when I published a blog on whether we should even teach neoclassical economics to undergraduate. And one of the reasons is the lack of ethics. So he mentioned that. He mentioned that we need to de-emphasize the discussion of efficiencies in economics. We need to reduce the emphasis on empirical methods. And then he said, economists, and I want to say that in his blog, he was very clear that his blog really was a criticism of neoclassical economics, of mainstream economics. He says there are many non-mainstream economists that just got it right. But he said that mainstream economists need to be more humble, that there's a lack of humility. And, this is very much reminiscent of the quote by Keynes when he says, if economists could be made themselves more humble on the same level as dentists, that would be much welcomed. So here Deaton is echoing Keynes, the master, and so this is very much a welcome blog, and it is quite and like I said, since the financial crisis, there's been quite a few sort of similar blogs, but right before the financial crisis, mainstream economists were declaring victory over the business cycle. This famous Robert Lucas presidential address talk, where the problem of recession had been solved. Business cycles, booms and busts have been solved. That somehow economists got it. We won. And then Olivier Blanchard, at the very beginning of the crisis, says, no, the state of macro is good. It's growing, it's progressing, it's quite exciting. People like, again, Bernanke, again, Blanchard refused to think that economic policies had anything to do with the crisis. Now, these were said some 15 years ago, 14 years ago, and today they're now quite, what's the word I'm looking, naive. I don't think anyone would say that today. So there's an emerging consensus that we need to rethink economics, and that there is some disarray. Now, I think disarray is not critical enough. I think it's much worse than that. But But how did we get from, you know, Blanchard and Bernanke claiming that macro is great? And there's been several papers, if you Google the state of macroeconomics, there's been several papers written on that topic. And the earlier ones are closer to Bernanke's views, but the later ones, you know, they're becoming more and more critical with a hindsight of time. So how do we get from that naive position to arguing that there's some disarray today? Well, I think that it begins in the early 1980s with the rise of neoliberal era, the privatization, deregulation period, the election of Margaret Thatcher, the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States. And this was the beginning of the crisis in aggregate demand, which is basically secular stagnation. Now, before secular stagnation, there was this sort of period of the great moderation. And this is where Bernanke and Blanchard's optimistic view come from. We went through a period of about 15 years of very low output variability, low inflation, and it certainly gave the impression that we had somehow vanquished the business cycle. But, you know, to paraphrase, and this is perfectly an example of Minsky, where periods of great stability, the great moderation, leads to periods of great instability, the financial crisis. And so anyone who was brought up on Keynes and Kiletsky and Joan Robinson and Minsky knew the great moderation was simply and could not have been anything but the calm before the storm, and that's exactly what happened. The history of financial crises is one of crises and stability and crises and stability going back 2,000 years. So this was an obvious sort of episode. The Great Moderation had to lead to the Great Recession and financial crisis. And, you know, another reason fueling Bernanke's and Blanchard's views, what I call naive views, was this idea that their model, whether they were micro-based or not, the mainstream model of neoclassical economics is based on the idea of convergence and stability. The probability, the idea that a crisis could occur just simply is not in the cards. So when things go bad, or when things begin to go bad, the assumption is market forces will drive the system back to stability and equilibrium. And that's the thinking of those models. Whereas, you know, for Keynesians, post-Keynesians, crises are endogenous. So like I said, stability leads to instability. So it was a question of time, and especially if you look at privatization, deregulation, the kind of policies that were adopted since the 1980s, it led to an immense deterioration, a crumbling of income distribution. Income inequality went to levels, if you believe in Piketty, not seen since 1929. And sure enough, at that time, the system collapsed, and that inevitably the system collapsed as well. And for me, there's a link there to income inequality. The more unequal your society, the more you're prone to instability. Developing economies are more unequal, and so therefore prone to more instability, more sort of stagnation, more prone to crises in aggregate demand. And this is what, Bob Solow called Dumb and Dumber macroeconomics. And so this is sort of a brief history of the type of policy framework that we went through since the financial crisis and since before that. And so in that sense, the financial crisis was simply the inevitable result of the rise in neoliberal economic policies. And that was also accompanied by the rise of monetary policy dominance, or what I've called monetary policy dominance in a series of papers in the late 2000s. It was the exclusive use of monetary policy to fine-tune economic activity. And this is within the context of an inflation-first policy of central banks. So the idea is that great economic stability comes first and foremost from bringing inflation down and keeping it down. So low and stable inflation levels are a precursor to greater economic stability, and hence the whole literature on central bank independence. But it is predicated on a number of very stringent assumptions. I wrote a paper called The General Ineffectiveness of Monetary Policy. And, this idea of monetary policy dominance rests on inflation being first and foremost demand determined. Because for monetary policy to reduce inflation, it needs to have a transmission mechanism that works on economic activity, and that in turn must work on inflation. So inflation here is thought to be the result of excess demand. So if higher interest rates reduce aggregate demand, it therefore reduces inflation. But we know it doesn't work like that. We know, for example, in the post-COVID era, demand had very little to do with inflation. It was all sort of cost related. It was all, oil and other commodity prices, shocks. It had to do with bottlenecks and the like. And we know that in general, inflation is more cost driven. Inflation plays a very little role in determining inflation. So, so you have to question at that point, if that's the case, would monetary policy work in reducing inflation? Absolutely not. And let's not be misguided by the fact that inflation has come down at the same time that interest rates have gone up. There's a difference between causality and correlation. And even by the central bank's own admission, the transmission mechanism from increases in interest rates to lowering inflation is about 18 months. Yet inflation came down a mere 2 or 3 months after central banks began raising interest rates. So, it cannot be argued that the current monetary policy austerity had anything to do with bringing down inflation. Rather, it was about bottlenecks working themselves through. I wish I had put those slides up, but it's also about the price of oil having come down a lot since the war in the Ukraine began. So these had to do more with bringing down inflation, with wage inflation being very negligible as well. So, we have to question why we give monetary policy such prominence in fighting inflation. And I think it was a deliberate and conscious decision to remove the state from the affairs of the economy. It was argued that the state is inflationary, there are crowding out effects, and all of that. And so we need to avoid using fiscal policy. And so fiscal policy was downgraded. And you can see this in sort of all these DSG models or new consensus models, where there's no role for fiscal policy. And everything relies on monetary policy, Taylor rules, inflation targeting, central bank independence. So, but empirical, evidence shows that it doesn't work like that. This again, a reminiscence of what Keynes said about, maybe monetary policy to cure inflation is like killing a patient in order to treat the disease. And I truly believe that. I haven't seen much convincing empirical evidence to the contrary. So, there's something that needs to be said about that. And I think that one of the big culprits in that is, well, I was going to say is this, there's just bad models and bad ideas, and these ideas that, it's really funny. I was just telling my students last week that, in all sciences, once a new theory comes up that is proven correct, the old theories are abandoned in favor of the new theory. So, for example, when we discovered that it was the Earth that rotated around the sun and not the other way around, there you go. That made a revolution. But economics is very different in that sense. Once we realize that a theory is wrong, we simply double down. So, there's, especially following the crisis, how fiscal policy was used to save the system. Skidelsky had it right in 2009 when he published his book, The Return of the Master. But economics is very short-sighted. We forget. In 2007, when you went to some professional conferences, American Economic Association, in 2007, 8, 9, there were lots of papers criticizing mainstream theory. And then after that just disappeared. And it went back to business as usual. And we doubled down on these models that are highly critical, right? Dynamic, stochastic, micro-founded models, general equilibrium model, are highly questioned. And by a number of Nobel laureates, and they're saying it's, but for some reason the profession simply doubles down. But there's a price to that. Central banks don't take mainstream macroeconomics seriously anymore. They rely more on these empirical Keynesian models of the 70s, 80s, that they've developed even more, but even then, there's very little faith. Macroeconomists have lost a lot of credibility in this issue. When the Queen of England in 2009 asked economists, how come you didn't see the biggest event of your lifetime coming up? They just said, well, our models don't account for it, right? Models of convergence and stability. We've lost a lot of credibility since 2009, and we just haven't made it back. And, I can tell you a lot of stories when I, get contacted by, this has happened to me recently, get contacted by journalists. And they ask me questions about inflation and whatnot. And, they probably, So they didn't realize I was an academic. And when they asked me my credentials, I go, well, I'm a professor, and the tone changes. And they say, oh, never mind, we'd rather talk to an economist in the bank or something. Academic macroeconomists don't have much credibility anymore, especially in central banks. Now, this Colin Rogers, an Australian economist, and this is from a review of my book on the future of central banking. But he says this, whereas central bankers have largely abandoned or never adopted the use of such models, these dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, in favor of other models and empirical analysis more closely related to old Keynesian practice. And the funny thing is, I'm not surprised. These dynamic models, these macro-founded models, have no room for money. So I can certainly understand an academic economist doing these technical things and getting off on these technical models. But it's quite another for a central banker to entertain models that have no place for money. Claudio Borio, my favorite mainstream economist, formerly the chief economist at the Bank for International Settlement, basically call these barter models disguised as monetary models, right? They're about barter. There's no money in there. Or if there is money, it's just, they're sort of passive, and etc. So that's sort of my takedown on the mainstream when it has to do with monetary policy and monetary policy dominance. I'm not a big fan of the use of monetary policy. I don't think it fine-tunes economic activity. I think economic activity is quite insensitive to incremental changes in interest rates. And that's why it requires 10, 11 increases in interest rates. That's where we are now. In the United States, with inflation ticking back up, maybe there'll be a 12th increase in interest rates. But I'm not a big fan. I think consumption and investment are insensitive to incremental changes, but they do respond eventually to the cumulative impact of 11 increases in interest rates. And then finally, what happens is the system simply collapses. And that's why during the last year or so, there was a lot of talk about soft landing. Now, in the United States, people were saying, look, we succeeded in having a soft landing. But that's not because, that was despite of monetary policy. I'm not American, but the United States avoided a soft landing because of the Biden plan. Pure and simple, not because of anything that monetary policy did or did not do. And so otherwise, had it not been for the Biden plan, the United States would have been, I think, in a recession, pretty much like what England went through, Canada went through, is going through. Things seem to maybe changing a little bit, but we're not out of the woods by far. But I do think that, speaking of the Biden plan, we need to reclaim fiscal policy. Now here, a lot of good people are doing revisiting the value of fiscal multipliers, crowding in effects. Now I wrote a paper, I don't know when, 20 years ago, where I argue that multipliers are regime dependent. This is a topic that has now become quite fashionable. It means simply that the value of the multiplier changes through the business cycle. But I also argue that, and to my knowledge, I'm the only one that has done that, multipliers are policy dependent. So the bigger the fiscal spending, the bigger the value of the multiplier. Biden plan in question. So in other words, if you're going to spend to get yourself out of recession, spend big or go home. If you don't spend big enough, it won't have an impact because, recessions, Keynes tells us that business cycles are the result of bursts of optimism and pessimism. And recessions are periods of great pessimism. So you need to somehow change the expectations of firms, of consumers. You have to change their expectations and turn them around to optimistic position about future growth of aggregate demand. And banks, you need to convince banks that the future is bright, so they'll start spending again or lending again, so that businesses start spending again, and so consumers start consuming again. So you have to transform a period of great pessimism into a period of great optimism. And that is not easy to do. But, and I think that's the key we have to look at, what policies can do that. And I think that that requires quite substantial fiscal space to have that kind of impact. So in that sense, we got to talk about fiscal policy, but we also need to talk about economics and the public purpose. And I'm here thinking about a book by John Kenneth Galbraith from 1973 or 74 or something like that. I think that this is something, a sixth element in Angus Deaton's blog could have been sort of that we need to move away from an emphasis on the economic bottom line. So we need to think about, we need to stop thinking about, can we afford this? Can we, we can, COVID certainly showed us that governments are not subject to budget constraints. If you want to do this, build it, then they will come. Governments can always find a way to finance something. There might be repercussions, but that's a different question. But what we need to talk about first and foremost is what kind of society do we want to live in? Do we want a national health care, national dental care, national drug care, as we are discussing in Canada now? Do we want to have free education? Do we want to have, et cetera? So you figure out what the common good is, and then you figure out how to pay for it. That for me is the public purpose of economics. We figure out how do we want to live? If you want to live in a society where tuition is $100,000 a year and there's great poverty and there's no health care, etc., that's easy. Go live in the United States. That society exists. But that's why you have very lower taxes in the United States and all. There's a huge debate in Canada because the government is introducing, some social programs, and to pay for them, they're raising the capital gains tax, which affects like a handful of Canadians. But there's a huge outcry about that. But I think that's the right thing. Do we want this or that program as part of the social contract that we want? And if it is, then we have to have an economic contract to try to figure out how to pay for it. I just want to finish, because I think I'm at that point. A quick discussion in a minute on full investment. Now, this is a concept that we find in the general theory in Keynes. Keynes has one sentence on that, and he doesn't have much more, doesn't discuss it anywhere else, and doesn't give us much to go about. And basically, he says, we've got to go beyond full employment to full investment. And I interpret that to mean that a full investment society is precisely sort of what I just talked about, the social contract. But it is sort of, full employment is something that could happen today or tomorrow. but we may get out of it tomorrow, or we get, full investment is utilizing the full capacity of the state, the full capacity of public banks, the full capacity of the infrastructure to generate sort of full employment over the long run. Full employment usually is seen as a short run thing, very consistent with Keynes, but full investment is full employment over the very long run. You sort of build the infrastructure of society to the point where it guarantees full employment for, a generation. I'm writing a paper on that, so stay tuned. And thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you. That is a lot of information. So everyone, if you have any question, please open your mic and talk. If no one question right now, so I will go first. So I have read your logs almost a day, and I think a lot of information in here, and we know a lot about the issue of mainstream economy that cannot, in some cases, cannot respond to economies development, or some sort of economy policy that they cannot cover. And so I think post-Keynesian could be the idea that we try to make the use thinking that makes policies work. And so I want to know exactly that does the policymaker could focus on the purpose of the society, that what the people need, based on the people needs, or sometimes they need to look at on the theory critically and then follow the theory that sometimes it's not work in reality. Because I remember that in my country, when the pandemic is hit, the policymaker in some extent, they do not talk much about what the experience of other country did that or did that, and then look at the theory. But the policymaker, they try to implement the new policies based on what they think that it could be right in the current context. So they try to implement it. If it does not work, they try to find a new one. For example, the price of food has increased. So in Cambria, we use two currencies. One is its own currency, and another one is dollar. And the dollar is very high in the country, and so that they inject its own currency to the they buy collect the dollar in the market to the central bank, so to keep the price stability. That is the good way that they did in that country. So what you thought about it? Should policymaker focus much on theory or based on the reality in the society that people need?
Yeah, so, I think that we need to figure out what the type of society we want and how then best to serve that society, like I said. I know very little about Cambodia and the specific conditions, but I think that there's a quote by Keynes. If you give me a second, I'll find it, because I do think it's a great quote. I have found it. Anything we can actually do, we can afford. In the long run, almost anything is possible. We can do almost anything we like given time. In a good time, we can do it all, but we must work to a long-term program. And so, this for me are guiding principles, that we can do anything we want, but we have to figure out what we want. The only constraint is the political constraint, or, being slaves to old debunked theories. So, yeah.
And another thing is that currently we talk about screen transition, and I saw that some article that try to use that how monetary policy can be a tool that used to work on environment and also green transition, and that is the good point too, I think. What do you think about that? And another thing is that in some country, high price of real estate and also housing also very high, and so it might impact for vulnerable people that they cannot afford to buy the house. So that it's possible that we can use a monetary policy or fiscal policy that should subsidy some poor household to buy a house if they need.
Sure. I mean, yeah. I mean, again, we have to figure out what the common good is and, what kind of society we want to live in. Ideally, we want to live in a society where people can afford to live, can afford a house and can afford to live, and the environment is green. And so if these are principles that we believe in, then we just have to make it happen. And it's easy to make it happen. Like I said, the biggest obstacle is the political obstacle. We know what we have to do. We know what we have to do to start turning the economy around in terms of greenness. We have to stop using fossil fuels. We've got to shut down the fossil fuels. We have to reduce or eliminate our dependence on oil. We know what we have to do. And with respect to social housing, we know what we have to do. We have to build more homes. The solutions are not complicated. The solutions are easy. Politicians are making it more complicated than it has to be.
Yeah, thank you. Chanti, do you have any question? Please ask.
Well, if there's no other questions, I'm okay with that.
Yeah. I don't have a question. So I think because right now it's 10, it's around 12, right, in the time.
Yes.
So it is time to sleep for you. Okay, so that's all for me, and I thank you a lot for having you today, and that is the very insightful for me and for us that can listen to your talk, and we will learn a lot of new ideas and information about you. And I just read your blogs this morning about your response to the economists.
You read that? Yeah.
Yes, that's a good article. And thank you so much for your coming tonight, and look forward to see you in Cambodia next.
Yeah, in August. Thank you. Keep
Yes.
me involved. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Good luck.